Chapter 6, Mishnah 6. I think this is the 6th time. No, I don't know. But we're still working our way through this Mishnah, the various 48 milos, the 48 different attributes that a person has to have in order to be able to acquire Torah. And we've tried as best we can to split them into different clusters of the same theme, which would mean that today is the theme of love. That's today's theme, right? Because you're going to see it's very interesting how first we say that in order to acquire Torah, a person has to be what is called ahuv, which is a description of the person, it's a title. Ahuv, how would you translate that? Beloved, yeah, loved, beloved is ahuv. And then it tells us the things that we're supposed to love. So the implication is that how do you become ahuv? How does a person become beloved or loved? By loving the correct things. So what would you say without looking? What would you say we should love in order to be beloved? Or in this particular context, in order to be able to master or to have access to Torah, to be able to acquire Torah, what do you think we have to love? Torah, right? That's what you think. You'd expect that straight away on the list it should say Ohev es HaTorah, somebody who loves Torah. Doesn't say that. Doesn't say that. Okay, so you'd think that it should be to love other people. Okay, that's a good insight. Why? What's the connection between loving other people and being able to acquire Torah? Because it says that, right? But if you think about it, we'll get to it in a second. But if you think about it, very often people who are great academics are not necessarily good with people.
Yeah, I didn't see it.
So to be an academic, it doesn't necessarily mean that you have great EQ, and it doesn't necessarily mean that you love people. To the contrary, sometimes those are people who prefer to be away from people, and that's why they immerse themselves in academia. So it is interesting that you'd say to love people. Okay, let's have a look at the list as it is in the Mishnah. The very first thing that it says, which should not come as a surprise, Ohev es hamakon, to love Hashem, which should not come as a surprise. If a person wants access to Torah, it makes sense that a person should love Hashem. Then the next one is Ohev es habrios, to love people.
Does it say somewhere else?
It does. Ohev es habrios. Hillel said in the first chapter that you should be a student of Aaron, which is Ohev es habrios u'mekarban laTorah. The part of that is to love all people and to draw them close to the Torah. So here it's telling us that in order to access the Torah, a person has to love other people. Interesting. What else does it say?
Sorry, does it say anything about loving yourself?
It does not say anything about loving yourself. In fact, to the contrary, in 1 second, we're going to see a very interesting observation. So what have we got? We've got Ohev es hamakon, to love Hashem, Ohev es habrios, to love all people. Oh, I guess that does include yourself. All people. Most likely includes yourself. Then what does it say? Ohev es hatzedakos. We'll have to see how we're supposed to translate that. Is that tzedakos from the word tzedakah, or is it tzedakos from the word tzedek? Okay, we're going to have to see. Then Ohev es hatoichachos, to love rebuke. That's why I'm not so sure about loving yourself. Because if you love yourself, sometimes you don't like to hear rebuke. So that's interesting. And the last one is Ohev es hamesharim, which most of the commentaries say is to love integrity. And if a person doesn't have integrity, obviously they can't master Torah. So let's understand what these things are. But the first thing we have to look at is this principle of ahuv, to be loved or to be beloved. Now, by the way, this is going to link to the last Mishnah in this chapter, Mishnah/Brisa in this chapter, which is also going to speak about things that are beloved to Hashem. So keep that in mind, because over here we're just talking generically about the principle of ahuv, of being beloved. Is there anybody at all that comes to mind when you think about being beloved? Anybody in our history? Aaron, right? Why do you say Aaron? Because Aaron loved everybody else. Yeah? And so naturally, by the end of his life, the Torah tells us that when he passed away, everybody mourned, meaning that everybody obviously felt love for him because he had shown love for all of them. And therefore, every single person felt the loss of Aaron when he passed away. Yet, the Torah does not use the description or ahuv about Aaron. It used the expression that he was ohev, that it was somebody who was loving. He uses the expression ohev shalom, that it was somebody who loved peace, but not ahuv. Who is the person about whom we have the expression that they were beloved? Moshe, right? Where does it say about Moshe? Doesn't. It says Moshe Avdi. That's how Hashem refers to Moshe. Loi chein Avdi Moshe. My servant Moshe is not like any of the other prophets. So therefore, the title that is used for Moshe is a servant, and a servant is not necessarily a loving relationship. So who has a loving relationship? We already tried Aaron, right? So who is it? So the Torah tells us Avraham Oihavi. There you have it. Avraham Oihavi, which is an ambiguous statement. Abraham who loves me, or Abraham who I love. And so therefore the Barbanel points out that the term Ahuv is a term that is used first to refer to Abraham. But he also points out that there are a number of occasions through the Torah where Hashem refers to the entire Jewish people as his beloved. Again, not Doidi, let's not get confused with the month of Elul, but the word that Hashem says, Ahuv, or that I love, or Hafti Eschem Omar Hashem, the Pasuk says, right? That I have loved you, says Hashem. So therefore, the Abarbanel points out that Ahuv is a very elevated status that is reserved for very special individuals like Avraham, or very special groups of people like the Jewish nation generally are called Ahafti Eschem, I love you, says Hashem. Now, what does that mean? What does it mean to be Ahuv? This is where it gets really interesting. What does it mean to be loved? Of course, you could say that, psychologically, emotionally, you could describe what it means to be loved. What does it mean to be loved? It means somebody cares about you, right? But let's try and unpack that for a moment, because what the Abarbanel says is really, really interesting. I will put a caveat that what the Abarbanel says about being beloved does take us into a whole conversation, which is beyond the scope of today's shiur, about how the relationship between Hashem and his world works. So we're going, it's just important to know that what we're looking at now is in a very specific context, not necessarily something that you should apply across the board. And you'll see why I'm saying that in a moment. So how do you know that you're loved? Okay, let's do this a little differently. How do Jewish mothers remind their children that they what?
You feed them.
No, that's how you show them that you love them. But how do Jewish mothers remind their children how the children should show them that they love them? They nag them. What's that? Covered.
You remind them that you carry them for now.
You remind them, right? So what's the classic what's the classic line of the Jewish mother? Exactly. You never call. That's the line. You never call. How do I know that you love me? You're never in touch. You know that story of the older Jewish woman, and her son phones her. He says, "How are you doing?" She says, "I'm doing fine. I just haven't eaten in 36 days." He says, "You haven't eaten in 36 days? Why on earth have you not eaten in 36 days? She says, "I was worried you would call. I didn't want to have food in my mouth when I answered the phone." So how do you know that you're loved? When somebody pays attention. When somebody shows you on a regular basis that they're thinking about you, they do things to show that they love you. That's how you know that you're loved. That's why if you pick up a phone, you make a phone call, you send a message, you remember something that's important in that person's life. In other words, let's put that into language of Hashem to us. This is where it gets really interesting. How do you know Hashem loves you? You're going to wake up in the morning, you're going to say, Modeh Ani, and I acknowledge the fact that Baruch Hashem, I'm alive for another day. Or as I saw it put very interestingly in a talk from the Lubavitcher Rebbe, the month of Elul is supposed to be the month of taking stock of the whole year. What does it mean to take stock? To remember how many brachos Hashem has given us and ask ourselves if we've paid back enough in our dedication. Right? So how do I know that Hashem loves me? Not just because generically I wake up in the morning and there's still a roof over my head and I have a family and all those things, although they are all brachos, but I know Hashem really loves me when things happen and I can see this is Hashem's hand in my life right now in a very clear, specific way. And it could be something massive or it could be something relatively unimportant. So it could be, for example, the person who gets on a plane and they sit next to somebody and they get talking, and it turns out that the person who's on the plane next to them is exactly who they needed to get in touch with in order for something to happen, whether it's to find the connections to help somebody medically or for a business opportunity. Then you know that Hashem is really looking out for you. Because look what he did. He put this person right next to me. The other day, somebody told me that literally the story just happened. They were driving here, just not far from here, and they came to a major intersection by by Belfour Park over there. There's the big intersection, and the light turned green, but they were slightly distracted by something that was going on the side, so they didn't drive immediately as it turned green. They were delayed for like literally a second, and as they went through the green, somebody came through the red the other way and hit their car. And if they hadn't delayed that second, it would have hit on the driver's side. So then you realize, like Hashem's looking out for you. You have moments like that, right? How do you know that you're loved? When you feel that somebody's paying attention to the little details of what's relevant in your life. So therefore the Barbanel says that ahuv means that a person has very clear hashgacha pratis in their life. Very clear, specific, personalized divine providence. That is ahuv. That is somebody who is beloved in Hashem's eyes. Now you've got to ask yourself the question. That's what he says, right? So you've got to ask yourself the question. These are supposed to be characteristics that we can work on in order to reach a position where we could receive the Torah in the way, or where we could acquire the Torah in the way that Hashem wants us to. Surely this is not in our hands. If Hashem decides that He's going to pay us that kind of attention, surely that's if Hashem decides to do it, if we are beloved in Hashem's eyes. So perhaps, Abravanel doesn't say this, just a thought that crossed my mind, that perhaps as we sensitize ourselves to how much we are loved, as we sensitize ourselves to recognizing the moments in our lives where there is this hashgacha pratis, this incredible personalized divine experience and divine providence, that makes us more open to learn what the Torah is all about, because we're seeing Hashem in our lives. Whereas if a person ignores that or isn't able to see that, you can't actually feel Hashem in our lives, well then it's possible that we can't really access the Torah as Hashem's Torah, because we're not feeling that direct relationship between Hashem and us. So possibly that's what he's alluding to in that interpretation. Now the next thing is not so surprising. That we have to love Hashem. That goes without saying, surely, right? Surely it goes without saying that we have to love Hashem. The question is, what does it mean? How do we know if we love Hashem? Very often we have these expressions, we have these principles in Judaism, we speak about them, we learn about them, and then we're not quite sure exactly how you identify if they've actually happened. So how does a person know that they love Hashem? I remember many, many years ago, I used to visit a particular individual who was not religious, and they always used to tell me, I know that Hashem loves me, and I love Hashem. And it was a very profound principle, because it's not that they came from a religious background, it's not that they were observant, and yet they felt this very strong, loving connection between themselves and Hashem. Question is it good enough just to feel it? Now, I said the word just, and that was specific, because we do have to feel it. I'll explain to you what I mean. Would you agree that it's a positive mitzvah in the Torah to love Hashem? Would you agree?
Yes.
How do you know? Because we say it every single day in the Shema, ve'ahavta es Hashem Elokecha, that you have to love Hashem your God, v'chol levavcha, with all your heart, or the plural of your heart, as the Gemara points out, v'chol nafshecha, and with all your soul, or v'chol moedecha, and with all your might, which the Gemara says includes your resources, your financial or physical resources. Okay, so we have to love Hashem. How do we know if we've done it? How do we know if we've fulfilled the mitzvah? Okay, let's step out of that for a second. There's also a mitzvah, which is also recorded in the Shema, that you have to put a mezuzah on your door. How do you know if you've done it? Because there's a mezuzah on your door.
Yes.
That's how you know you've done it. There's also a mitzvah in the Shema that says that you have to tie tefillin on your arm and on your head. How do you know if you've done it?
Got them on.
And when you've no longer got them on, how do you know? So I can tell you from experience, as a card-carrying Chabadnik, who regularly has interactions with people and asks them, have you put on tefillin today? So very often when a person wants to tell that they have put on tefillin, they roll up their sleeve and there are still marks from where the tefillin were. Right? There's still marks. That's how you know that you've done the mitzvah, because there is a physical impact on the physical body. How do you know if you love Hashem? Must be that there's a physical sensation. We know what love is. We understand love from other contexts in our lives. There has to be some kind of a similarity between the love of Hashem that we believe that we have and love in any other context. If it's not an actual feeling, an actual emotional state, then it's unlikely that it is love. Sometimes people will tell us, maybe they'll tell specifically the rabbis, Rabbi, I'm not so religious, but I'm a Jew at heart. And I always wonder about that. That sounds dangerous to me, to be a Jew at heart. Can you imagine taking 613 mitzvahs and putting that all on one organ, the heart? It's too much pressure. The way Judaism is designed is you're supposed to diffuse the pressure between all the different parts of the body. So to be a Jew only at heart is high risk. You've got to share some with the hands and with the mind, etc. So when people say a Jew at heart, effectively what they're saying is I have a sentiment, I have a very strong sentiment towards Hashem, and that's probably true. But how do we know that it's love of Hashem? You know the story, it's a well-known story about the vegan at the restaurant. You know the story of the vegan at the restaurant? So the vegan's at a restaurant, and the vegan obviously orders vegan options. And at the next table, they hear this interaction between the waiter and one of the customers. And the customer says to the waiter, I love fish. So the vegan gets very excited. So, this is like a kindred spirit, I also love fish. I'm very involved in Save the Whales, and the fact that they shouldn't be slicing up dolphins to put in tuna, and that kind of thing. I also love fish. So you know what? I think after a while, I'm going to go over to this person, I'm going to make an acquaintance, and we'll get talking about our activism for fish. Of course, as you can already guess, a few minutes later, the waiter walks out with this big roasted salmon for the guy who loves fish. So the vegan is incensed, furious, marches over to the table indignantly and says, you don't love fish, you love yourself. And if you think about it, it's not always so clear if our love is love of the subject of our love or love of ourselves. Right? I once heard a person say, and you can debate the grammar of this, but I once heard a person say that in English, the way that people express that they love each other is actually misguided. Because what does a person say? Say, I love you. So this person said, that's not love. That's selfishness. If you really loved somebody, you would say, you, I love. Where's the emphasis? Is the emphasis on self, or is the emphasis on the subject of our love? So very often when a person says that they love Hashem, we've got to ask ourselves, well, do we love Hashem, or do we love what Hashem does for us? In other words, I love me. And therefore, because Hashem does nice things for me, that's why I love Hashem. Which would be toxic in a human relationship. Can you imagine that the only reason a person loves somebody is because of what they do for me? That's not love. That's self-interest. So how do we know that we love Hashem? Ohev es hamokim. So Rashi says that Ohev es hamokim, to love Hashem, means that when we do what Hashem expects of us, the Torah and the mitzvahs, we do them out of love of Hashem, not out of expectation of what we're going to gain. That's how we know. So this is not so simple, by the way. I mean, it's easy to speak about. It's not so simple. Because just the other day, somebody who is not necessarily a very observant Jew, maybe very secular Jew, got quite offended because I sent out a message, one of my daily messages, about how a person can give tzedakah. The Gemara says this. A person can give tzedakah and say that I'm giving tzedakah in order that so-and-so should heal, or in order that so-and-so should whatever. You give tzedakah with a particular intention. And that's acceptable. Not only is it acceptable, the Gemara says, Harizet Tzaddik Gomor, such a person is completely righteous. Their dedication to Hashem is whole. This person was very offended. You don't give tzedakah in order to get something in return. You give tzedakah to show gratitude to Hashem for what you have. After that, I sent him my banking details.
Yes.
But it's an interesting point. It is an interesting point. We know that there are things within the Torah that we could do that are guaranteed, or at least are supposed to bring us certain material blessings in response. If you follow the mitzvahs, Hashem says, I'll give you the rain in the proper time. So if a person does any of those things because they want the response, because they want the bracha, because they want the reward, it's valid. It's absolutely valid. But it's not considered love of Hashem. That's self-interest. Whereas if a person does something with absolutely no intention of anything in response, like the Rambam says, Oise es ha'emes mipnei shehu emes. That a person does things because they are correct, because they are true, which, by the way, we're going to speak about a little bit later. Oyheva samei shorim. We're going to talk about this principle. Where a person is motivated, I'm doing this because I love Hashem. It's something we can all relate to. For example, there is this principle, I don't know if you've ever heard of it. There's this principle of men who go to shopping malls with their wives. You ever heard of this? That is an expression of love.
I know someone do that.
Because they're not going for any personal interest. Why would you go to a shopping mall? What's so, just put a limit on the card. You know the story of the couple that's walking through the shopping center. There's a couple like they've been married for 50 years, and this young couple walks past and says, "Oh, look, this is so sweet. They're still 50 years down the line, walking, holding hands in the shopping mall." And he turns around and he says, "This is not as romantic as it seems. If I let go, she shops." What's an expression of love? When you have no personal interest in something, but you're doing it because the person you care about, the person you love, finds that important. So that's what so you do it. You participate. You're part of it. You show that you care about the things that the other cares about. So love of Hashem means, as Rashi points out, that a person is doing what they're doing because they love Hashem, because this is important to Hashem. It doesn't matter what I'm going to get out of it. It doesn't matter what kind of personal gain there might be. Seeing as this is the chapter which is called Kinyan HaTorah, and this particular section is the 48 different traits that a person is supposed to have in order to be able to acquire Torah. Well, one of the most key factors of being able to acquire Torah is to love Hashem. To be learning Torah because that's an expression of how I love Hashem, rather than how I just want to become the greatest scholar, and you've heard this already because this theme has repeated a few times during this chapter. So it's when a person is motivated and driven by love of Hashem rather than love of their personal interests, that's when a person can truly master Torah. How does a person know that they love Hashem? Oyhevas abriyos. That's the next line. By showing that you love people. What does that mean? So, just stepping out of the Mishnah for a moment, just to share a thought. I just recently did a whole shir about this, so it's very much on my head. What do we say about the month of Elul? We say, Ani ledoidi v'doidili. And you've heard that I don't know how many times. In fact, just before Elul started, somebody said to me, I know what's going to happen in Elul. All of the rabbis are going to overuse that line, Ani ledoidi v'doidili. So I said, you know what? You're right. Exactly. And on Pesach, we overdo the Pesach Haggadah. We do it every single year. That's how Jews roll. We repeat the same information, and hopefully this time we get a whole different perspective. So the question is, how do you get from Elul to Ani ledoidi v'doidili? What's the link? It's an acronym, right? So Elul is an acronym. Aleph stands for Ani, Lama stands for ledoidi, Vav stands for v'doidi, and Lamed stands for Li. Okay. Who are we talking about? Hashem. So Hashem is our beloved. So why doesn't it just say Ani la Hashem, v'Hashem li? I reach out to Hashem during this time of the year, and Hashem reaches back to me. That would have worked. Would have been the same acronym. Why does it have to be v'doidi? Doidi. Why? Why all this poetry? So the various insights that are given, but one that crossed my mind is, because who says that Hashem is beloved? How do you know that Hashem is beloved? How can you tell? Ani lo dodi, Hashem is beloved to me. Prove it. How does Hashem know, or how does anybody know that Hashem is beloved to me? So I'll give you a little example that possibly you could relate to. Imagine it's Mother's Day. Yeah? You wake up in the morning on Mother's Day, and the kids have made a beautiful sign and they've hung it in the room, Happy Mother's Day. And then they bring breakfast in bed. How do you feel?
Cherished.
Feel amazing. You feel ahuv. You feel like you're exactly cherished. It's unbelievable. 5 minutes later, these kids are ripping each other to pieces, screaming, yelling, beating each other up. Ah, he hit me first, whatever, right? What does the mother say? If you really wanted me to have a happy Mother's Day, you wouldn't be beating each other up. Why is that? Because the nature of people is that if you love me, then show love to those people I love. How do we know that we love Hashem? How do we know le doidi? How do I know that Hashem is doidi? How do I know? If I cherish those Hashem loves. If you want to show a parent that you love them, you'll love their children. So how do you know ohev esamokim? How do you know that you love Hashem? Because ohev esabrios. Because you love the people that Hashem put into our environment, into our space. The people that Hashem created. That's how I know. That's why it's called brios. It doesn't say ohev es anoshim or ohev es Yisrael, any of those words. It says ohev es habrios. You love those who Hashem has created. Because when we love those who Hashem has created, then we are illustrating that we love Hashem. As the Sephorno points out, he says, what does it mean to love the creations? It's a beautiful insight. It means to treat them with the kindness that Hashem treats us. That's what it means to love other people. What does it mean to treat them with the kindness that Hashem treats us? So we say every single morning, Moideh ani lefanecha melechai. What are we saying when we wake up in the morning? And we say, thank you Hashem. What are we saying? So the Chazal tell us, what are we saying? We're saying that at night we go to sleep. And when we go to sleep, we take our neshama and we deposit our neshama for safekeeping in Hashem's hands. It's called a pikodon. It's called a deposit. And the next morning, it's up to Hashem whether or not He returns the deposit. We have no input. You don't have, just before you wake up, you don't have a dream that says, should I wake up this morning? And then you decide yes. We have absolutely no control over the fact that we wake up. So that's the gift that Hashem gives us, that we wake up again in the morning, that He returns the soul that He took as a deposit from us. So Chazal say, why do we do this every single morning? To remind us that there are people in our lives, maybe, who also owe us something. And maybe don't deserve our good graces because they're still indebted to us. Like we are indebted to Hashem when we go to sleep at night. We haven't necessarily lived up to all of the things that Hashem expected of us and all of the things that Hashem asked of us. And yet, in His great kindness, Hashem gives us the neshama back every single morning. And not only does He give it back, He gives it out more refreshed than it was when we gave it to Him the night before. That teaches us how we should treat other people. How are you ohev esamokim? How do you love Hashem? Ohev esabrios, because you love His children. The Maharal takes it a step further. Maharal tells us Torah was given, as we well know, this is the distinguishing factor between the Jewish divine revelation and lahavdil, other stories of divine revelation. Usually it's some person on a mountain all by himself and he has a revelation, comes running back to the village and tells everybody what happened. Our divine revelation was with millions of eyewitnesses at the foot of Mount Sinai. And our divine revelation was the giving of the Torah, which is the theme of this chapter. How do we acquire the Torah? How was the Torah given? Not to an individual. Specifically not to an individual. It was given to the klal, it was given to the entire community together. Therefore, says the Maharal, if a person has a loving relationship with the community, they can receive the Torah. But if a person has issues with individuals in the community and therefore they are distanced or disconnected from individuals in the community, how can they receive the Torah? If you're not oyev v'sabrios, if you're not loving the people, then you're not part of the collective, and the Torah can only be shared with the collective. It's quite a fascinating insight. Okay, that's how Hashem gave us the Torah. So that's how Hashem gives us the Torah on a daily basis. Therefore, absolutely key to acquiring Torah is love of our fellow Jews. Love of those members of the collective. It's incredible insight. Once we're at that point, then oyev es hatzedakos. Then we will love tzedakos. Again, as you can hear in that word, you could take it from the perspective of tzedakah, which is obviously being charitable. Now that makes sense because you've just said oyev es habrios. You've just told us in order to access the Torah, what you need to love the people. If you love the people, you're going to be charitable to the people. You're going to help the people. But let's remind ourselves for one moment that the word tzedakah comes from the word tzedek, which is righteousness. What's the difference between the conventional word charity and the word tzedakah, which comes from tzedek? In the mindset of people who speak about charity, charity is always my goodness. I'm a good person, I'm generous, I'm benevolent, I'm caring, I'm tolerant, empathetic, whatever word. Therefore, I help other people. So for example, if we stop at an intersection and a beggar comes over to the car and we give something to the beggar, money, food, second-hand clothing, whatever it is we give to the beggar, why have we done that? Because we're good people. Or because we feel guilty not to do something, right? Feel guilty not to do something. So that is an expression of personal kindness. Personal kindness is an unreliable resource. Because what if I woke up this morning in a foul mood and I'm irritated by everybody and I didn't sleep enough last night? Then the beggar comes to the window and and this is one country in the world where there's a whole sign language that happens, on street corners. The whole sign language of that I'm hungry and the sign language I don't have money, and we've got this whole thing going. So if I'm irritated, then they're going to lose out. That means to say that it's an inconsistent behavior. What's tzedakah? Tzedek. Correctness. Righteousness. It's the correct thing to do. Why do we give tzedakah? Because Hashem told us to. Because it's the correct thing to do. If it's the correct thing to do, then it has nothing to do with my mood. Then I do it because it's correct. And if it is correct to help every beggar at every intersection, then I'm required to help every beggar at every intersection. You can ask your local halachic authority whether that is required or not. But if it is required to give tzedakah, for example, if it is required to take 10% of what I earn and distribute it to charitable causes, then I don't have the luxury of walking around feeling so good about myself. Wow, look at me, I'm an amazing person. I just discharged an obligation. In the same way as if I put a mezuzah on my door, I don't afterwards think I'm a very special person because I put a mezuzah on my door. That's my obligation as a Jewish person, is to have a mezuzah on my door. It's my obligation as a Jewish person to give tzedakah, to be charitable to others. Oyev es hatzedakos, a person who loves knowing what is correct and just and then lives accordingly, that person is open to the Torah. Because the Torah is not a matter of public opinion. The Torah is not going to speak a language that suits our particular sentiments. The Torah is going to tell us what's right. And so, oyev es hatzedakos, a person who loves that which is correct, that which is appropriate, that which is right, such a person is open to be able to receive or to be able to hear what the Torah has to say. Which brings us to the next point. Oyev es hatoichachos, a person who loves rebuke. Let's be honest. Who is this person? Where do you find this person who loves rebuke? Who loves rebuke? There's a saying amongst Hasidim that a person should embrace criticism because it will allow us to raise ourselves to the highest spiritual levels. What does that mean? What does it mean to love rebuke? Nobody loves rebuke, realistically. And rebuke is maybe a word that we don't use so commonly.
Sometimes it puts you on the right path.
Of course, it puts you on the right path if you're open enough to hear it, right? But if you're open enough to hear it, doesn't mean that you love it, right? Love is a strong word. Somebody who loves rebuke. So I recently heard a very interesting, not from a Jewish source, but a very interesting psychological principle that they tested, and effectively it emerges like this: that every person in their life, generally speaking, has their cheerleaders and their critics. That's generally how it works. And you're generally a happier person if you have more cheerleaders than critics. But, what's that?
Your children are your biggest critics.
Your children are your biggest critics. Could be. That depends what age they are, I guess. So the thing is that, so here's the psychological research, that neither one of them is helpful. Critics are not helpful because you avoid them or you get resentful of them. Cheerleaders are not helpful because they keep telling you to do what you're doing even if it's not the best thing to be doing. So what do they find? That those individuals who invite constructive criticism, in other words, go looking for constructive criticism, who ask for advice, those are the people who progress the most. So for example, if a person were to get up, I don't know, hypothetically, and give a shiur, and then afterwards everybody comes out and says, oh, that was such a wonderful shiur, that's great, but the person doesn't grow from that. Whereas if a person had to say, okay, so you tell me now, what do you think we could do differently in this shiur? That person's going to grow. So that's what he's telling us over here. Doesn't mean that when the person is being criticized or when the person is being rebuked, they love their experience. That's not what it means. But they love the concept of being open to hear criticism and rebuke. And it's so interesting because normally what happens, and this goes a little bit back all the way to something we learned much earlier in Pirkei Avos, noyach l'sishchoires, that a person should always be affable to those who are younger than them. In other words, usually you find that people who are very qualified in a particular area are the people who are least comfortable or least open to hear criticism or hear rebuke because I'm the expert. Unfortunately, this comes at a high cost sometimes in the medical field, where a person believes themselves to be the medical expert, so they don't want to hear necessarily insights even from the patient. And sometimes it comes at a huge cost. Whereas the person who is open to hear that insight, that feedback, that advice, that rebuke, that individual is open for a whole different experience of growth. Now, when we come to Torah, if a person is if a person has reached a point which they should, they love to know what is correct. They love to know what the Torah expects rather than what I would like the Torah to say. That person is naturally going to be to be open and excited and happy to hear those people who are going to give feedback that will push me back into the place where I need to be. Or as the Maharal puts it, that if a person is not open to be able to hear rebuke, that means that there's an element of arrogance that has crept into the picture, and a person who is arrogant is blocked from Torah. We already saw this because one of the earlier characteristics was anova, that a person has to have humility. So when a person is willing and open to hear, that's when they learn. We also know this from the famous saying in the Gemara, Mitalmidai yoser mikulam, that I actually learn the most from the people that officially I'm supposed to be teaching. Not that they should rebuke or criticize, but it's the same principle. When a person is open to hear things which are not necessarily cheerleading and not necessarily comfortable and not necessarily encouraging, but accurate, that's where a person can actually hear what the Torah has to say. Also, one other very important point is you do realize that in the Torah itself there are sections of rebuke that not everybody wants to hear. We know it's in the parasha that's coming up next Shabbos, Kisavoy, which has the Toichacha, it has Moshe's rebuke of the Jewish people, telling them if you don't behave in a particular way, things may happen. We see it often with the prophets. We see it in the Gemara. We see it even in contemporary times, illustrating that there's a part of the Jewish experience, there's a part of access to Torah, which is to be open to hear rebuke. When we're out of line, we need to be able to hear it, because that's the only way that we'll correct, and that's the only way we'll be humble enough to accept the Torah. And that brings us...
So I just want to ask
The right rebuke.
It's a very, very good question, or point, I should say. It's a very good point. Who gives the rebuke? Now, there are two sides to this story. From the perspective of the person who is giving the rebuke, the pasuk is clear. Hoicheach, toichiach, es amisecha. It's an interesting word. That you should surely rebuke amisecha. How do you translate that? Your contemporary. It comes from the words im she'itcha. The person who is with you at the same kind of spiritual level. That's who we are entitled to rebuke. And the Gemara goes into detail about it. That you have to have learnt in the same educational system. You have to have the same level of observance. You have to be currently in the same circumstances. Then you have the right to rebuke somebody else. That's the one side of the coin, the person giving the rebuke. It is inappropriate to give rebuke to somebody who doesn't have the same spiritual circumstances as you do. That's not what we're talking about here. Here we're talking from the perspective of the listener. And here we apply the principle, kabel esa emes mimi she'omroi, that a person should be open to accept the truth from whoever it is that is saying the truth. Because they may have work to do in terms of, knowing how they should share rebuke, etc. But if Hashem has decided that I need to hear this, that implies that there's value in hearing it. So that's what I'm saying. There's two sides to the coin. And so the last part that he says is Oihev es hamishorim, a person who loves integrity. What does it mean to love integrity? Well, of course, firstly, that they want that's a value, that's an aspiration for them to live with integrity. The Torah is a book of integrity, Magid Meisharim. It's the words that tell us how we should live with integrity. It is the Derech HaYeshara, the path of integrity. That's exactly what Torah is all about. It's about teaching us integrity. At the same time, one of the meanings of integrity, as the Maharal points out, is not to come to our learning with a particular ulterior motive. Why am I learning? Because I'm curious about the subject, or because I want to become a great scholar, or because I want to have the accolades when people turn around afterwards and say, wow, you know so much about this. Meisharim is where a person learns with integrity just simply to know Hashem's Torah because it is Hashem's Torah. That's what it means, integrity. The Abarbanel says something else. He says something very interesting. He says human bias is a very real thing. And because of human bias, very often when we learn something, without even realizing it, we superimpose our bias over the information. And so we come at a particular angle, we learn something, we say, I know exactly who it is that I now have to share that with because they need to improve this area in their life. Or we have something in our lives that we want to justify, so we find the part of the Torah that justifies that particular kind of behavior. So that is a lack of meisharim, he says. That's a lack of integrity, where a person is effectively learning Torah with their particular bias. Now, it's not so simple to release a bias. Not so simple. So therefore, oihev es hamisharim, when a person loves integrity, when a person loves that sense of the straight and narrow, what is correct, what is authentic, what is exactly, the value of the Torah, if that is an ideal of mine, if that's something that I love, then the likelihood is that I won't actually land up contaminating the information with my own bias. And so there you have it. What does it mean to be ahuv, to be beloved in Hashem's eyes? It means to love Hashem. It means to love the people that He has created. It means to love the values and the principles that the Torah stands for. Tzedakos, toichechos, and meisharim, the sense of righteousness, the sense of being open to learn, to hear, to move, to accept rebuke, and a high principle of integrity. If we love those things, then we're open to be able to hear what the Torah actually has to teach us, and then we can acquire the Torah in its pristine state.